everybody. Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to speak on this platform. Very pleased to be sharing a platform with Mihako-san as well. So, yes, I'm going to talk through lots of elements of cybersecurity. I'm going to try and not make it too technical. That's my aim, which I think is very possible, actually. So let's see how we go. So. So hello there. So I'm James Sullivan. I'm the Director of Cyber Research at RUSI. As was described at the top, we conduct research. We conduct research into cyber policy issues. We look at national cyber strategies. We look at the threat landscape. We look at issues relating to cybersecurity and resilience. So how we protect our networks, also how we react when networks are breached, what we need to do in those instances, and also looking at issues relating to offensive cyber, which touches upon a little bit of what I'm going to talk about today. So I think, to start with, we all remember that day when, finally Russian troops crossed the border and invaded Ukraine. I think, we all think that's, completely horrific what's happened. And I think, some of the events we've seen, you can become quite normalized to them 2 months on, but talking about cyber today, I think that does pale in comparison to some of the horrific scenes that we've witnessed and all of the accounts of them. And I think just to say I really do hope this conflict ends soon. What we were talking about really with cyber, there's a lot of talk really about cyber when there was the invasion. So to start with, I'm going to talk a little bit about cyber in Ukraine since 2014 and what happened and why there was a lot of expectation that at the point of invasion there was going to be a huge growth in cyber incidents in Ukraine, and we see a lot of talk about cyber warfare and cyber in conflict and really how modern warfare is fought. So I think to start with, I'll point out the fact that we've seen destructive attacks by Russia and its affiliates in Ukraine since at least 2014. So we've seen attacks on the energy sector, the transport sector, finance, on the Electoral Commission, business disruption as well. So this is nothing new. So we've seen Russian activity in Ukraine really unfolding on a daily basis, a weekly basis in terms of cyber operations. But I think this is really important. Russia was never going to install a new government through cyber attacks alone. So we read a lot about that, about how cyber was going to be the centerpiece of an invasion. And a lot of media talk about one big cyber attack. We see this quite a lot, references to cyber Pearl Harbors, cyber 9/11s. And we really do need to tone down this hyperbole to really understand what cyber is, what cybersecurity is, and move away from that rhetoric. So talking about the sectors they targeted, I'll talk a little bit now about what I think a cyber campaign entails. And there's different ways you can categorize it. I'm going to try and do it in quite a simple way, in the way I think cyber is used by states and their affiliates, and that's really important, something I'll come to. So I think the first area is intelligence gathering. So states, Russia included, will conduct cyber operations to gather data to benefit foreign policy decision making, to gather data to help them make strategic choices. And as I said, this is during warfare, outside warfare. This is just a common method used not just by hostile state actors, but by the West too. A second type of campaign are operations to disrupt and deceive the military. So we've certainly seen incidents of this during this conflict. You are launching a military campaign. You want to make advances on the ground, and by adopting a cyber operation, that can obviously benefit your operation. That could be by turning off some communications. That could be by turning off the electricity on a grid to give you some strategic advantage. So that's definitely the second area. But the third one, and I think this is really, really interesting when we talk about cyber operations, is the psychological element of them. And I touched upon this at the top when I talked about how there's a lot of hyperbole when it comes to cyber in the media. A lot of these operations, what they do, and even just the threat of them happening, is they seek to degrade public trust in our institutions, in our industry, and really, that fear of cyber is something which I think we really have to factor in when we ask, why do nations use cyber capabilities, and why are we so worried about them? I think the psychological element of the operations is really important. There are other ways in which you can kind of break down in the way in which cyber is used. So there can be attacks to disrupt critical national infrastructure. So I've touched upon that, the energy sector, transport, those things that help us run our daily lives. Obviously, we need them running 24/7, and even an hour's disruption can have catastrophic consequences. Secondly, we can talk about attacks which cause political disruption. And I talked about the undermining confidence in our institutions. Thirdly, economic disruption. And we see a lot of attacks on the financial sector. Economic resilience is linked to national security. Strong economies are linked to national security. So, the impact of cyber operations in those areas is very important. You could also be under attack yourself, and you can respond with cyber, so incoming threats. And then finally, as I talked about, the military operations. So that's an overview of the categories of cyber operations. If I touch a little bit upon what I think has happened in Ukraine since 2014, you can roughly divide it into three phases. This is quite broad. From in the first couple of years, we saw a lot of custom malware delivery, where Russian state actors mimicked hacktivists. They stole data, they conducted ransomware attacks, and we saw a lot of attacks on critical national infrastructure. And then there was a shift a couple of years later. It's quite a subtle one, but we saw increase in the scope of the attacks. We saw attacks on supply chains. We saw pseudo ransomware attacks where computer systems were locked out. And interestingly, we saw in the second phase, a lot of the attacks were tied with key dates in the Ukrainian calendar, so public holidays and things like that. And I say that's quite linked to the psychological element and undermining public trust. And then most recently, we saw just before the invasion, a lot of website defacements, wiper operations against government systems. So malware was delivered that sought to wipe data and delete or overwrite files. So that takes us right up to the point of invasion. So here we are. So the invasion's taken place, and as I said, the media is pumped and ready to report on cyber Pearl Harbors and cyber 9/11s, but what actually happened? So I think the first point, and I say this as a researcher, so the first bullet's quite classic, is it is too soon to draw wider conclusions. There was a hell of a lot of comment in February on cyber incidents in Ukraine and how it affected the global economy as well. We don't know very much. We find the details of these things out years later in some instances. So we do have to really caveat that we don't know everything. We have seen quite a lot of intelligence shared among the community beyond cyber, but still there are still things that remain secret. There are still things that governments don't want to share, and I think this is really important when we talk about the conclusions. But I have divided what I think we know so far into four areas. So I think we've seen some instances of disruptive and destructive attacks. We've seen some instances of hacktivism. So this is essentially groups with a political motive who conduct cyber operations. We've seen elements of data theft, and linked to this, just classic old school espionage. So I'll touch upon a couple of incidents now, if I may, and I'll just talk you through them. So I think the most known one is at the point of invasion, which was an attack on broadband satellite internet. So these were satellite terminals, where tens of thousands of satellite terminals stopped working at the point of invasion. And this news came out quite slowly. And the only reason we really knew about it was because there were reports from other countries of their access to this internet satellite service not working. And there were reports in Germany, Ukraine, Greece, Hungary, and Poland. So broadband was down. And some terminals, some of the modems were damaged. They were updated and then they just bricked. So they just stopped working. So an interesting thing here was we think this cyber operation targeted Ukraine, but then there was overspill, and that's something I will touch on later. So what was the aim here of this operation? It was to take out modems and other communications at the point of invasion. And we think that's because a lot of the Ukrainian military used this service for their communication activity. So modems were disabled. Internet access, which was supplied to Ukraine and several other countries in Europe, stopped. Some systems remained offline for 2 weeks. The total, I think, beyond Ukraine, 40,000 users were affected. There's been a lot of attribution recently on this. So the UK's talked about this incident, the US, and really interestingly, last week, the EU attributed this incident to Russian cyber operations. And that I don't think that's happened before. I don't think the EU has done that. So that's a really interesting takeaway. In terms of other types of incidents, so I touched upon hacktivism. This is a really interesting one. So Ukraine's cybersecurity community has organized itself on private messaging forums, but also we've seen individuals from other countries doing this. Some of the individuals were actually contacted directly by the Ukrainian Defense Ministry, and what was put together was what was called a swarm of hacktivists, so essentially a volunteer cyber army. This would comprise developers, marketers, cyber specialists. What have we heard about reports of them attempting to do so far? They've created tools to target Russian websites and take them down, targeting Russian propaganda websites. Some individuals we think have scanned for vulnerabilities on Russian servers and systems. We've seen a lot of anti-war messaging. You may have seen some of the reports, people watching TV in Russia, and then up comes a message, a pro-Ukrainian message. So some interesting elements of what hacktivists can do. But I would also point towards some concerns about that too, because you think it's obviously we all want hacktivists to do well if we're on their side, but actually, there might be some ethical concerns here as well. If we have individuals going into networks without the checks and balances in place, they could actually do more harm than good. There may actually be Western intelligence agencies operating in these networks. So when we think of hacktivism, it does come with those caveats. And then the final two, as I said, data theft and espionage. I think there have been lots of examples of elements of data being stolen, the Ukrainian government being targeted. There's examples of Lvov City Council's website suffering a data breach. We've had lots of reports from the big tech companies about phishing campaigns targeting Ukrainian media companies. So I think we have to understand that espionage does take place. Most things are digital now. This is what happens in and outside warfare, and I think that's really important. So we've seen little reported impact outside of Ukraine, but there have been incidents. I just don't think I've reported this big bang incident that I think everyone was waiting for. But as I said, I don't think this was necessarily going to happen. So the question is why? So why, when everyone has talked about big cyber events taking place at the point of warfare. Why has it not carried out like this? Again, I will point to the fact that I do think it's still a small snapshot in time. There may be other incidents, so we've got to be careful of drawing those wider conclusions. But there are some points we can point towards. We've seen Russian military action in Ukraine has had its limitations. We've all read the reports on that, about how the invasion is not going according to plan. There are a lot of tactical mishaps. So perhaps this is the same for cyber. These operations were not that well planned. So we must remember, when you're planning a cyber operation, you don't just press a big red button. These operations are resource intensive. They require time, they require money, they require brains. And there's no guarantees that you'll be in a network forevermore once you've managed to breach it. It all depends on the timing, the links to other interventions, how your adversary responds. So if we think back to, there was a famous attack on the power grid in Ukraine, there's various reports about the amount of time that had impact for, which could have come down to hours, and the preparation for that may have taken well over a year. So again, we have to think these things are resource intensive, and when you're focusing on a military campaign with lots of other different types of traditional interventions, perhaps cyber wasn't top of the list. The second point is about good cyber defense. So I pointed back to 2014 and I said everyone has been talking about cyber incidents in Ukraine. Well, perhaps Ukraine was well prepared. Perhaps Ukraine had good defense in place, and it had worked very well with private sector partners, with international allies to really build those defenses in place. Again, this is the sort of information I think it will take a long time to really understand, but I think it's a solid assumption to make. But are there limitations as well to cyber operations in warfare? An interesting blog, which I'll point you towards, the Lawfare blog, which was written by Kieran Martin, he points to some limitations of cyber during warfare. The ease. So as I touched upon, this is complex and resource intensive. We've seen some examples where Russia has just bombed a TV tower or cut some gas pipes. Maybe that's easier really than traditional, more complex cyber operations. Effectiveness as well. So we talk about all these cyber attacks. I've just touched upon a range of incidents, but how impactful were they? Did they actually do much damage? I talked about the modems that were taken down on the point of invasion. How much did that actually damage the Ukrainian army? When I talk about malware entering government systems, did it actually wipe the data? We don't know. Ransomware attacks as well. Are these having a massive impact on Ukrainian financial sector or its citizens? And then also finally, escalation is another interesting one, because we do know that there is potential through cyber operations for things to escalate quite quickly if you take down some critical national infrastructure. So maybe it's not really an area where you want to conduct those activities without some thought. The penultimate bullet's an interesting one, and I don't really know the answer to this. There has been a lot of discussion on it recently, which is, did we just overestimate Russia's capability? Did we create this big bad cyber monster and it doesn't actually exist? I'm not quite sure of the answer for that at the moment, but what we can say is certainly so far we haven't seen the type of activities we thought a reckless cyber nation like Russia would conduct. So, my final bullet is, we do have to wait and be patient on this, but I hope those are some good initial conclusions. So now to just touch on the impact on global cybersecurity. We've seen lots of warnings, lots of advisories from foreign governments. So I think, even though we haven't seen the scale of incidents we thought, from what we know so far, I still think that this is a wake-up call to the West and the rest of the world to really improve its cybersecurity. There's a lot of advisory on how to do that. A lot of this is down to basic cybersecurity, basic cyber risk management, following controls, and having instant response plans in place. I've talked a lot about critical national infrastructure. That's clearly important. The need to protect critical national infrastructure should not be ignored. And then there's some other elements to this. I've talked a lot about nation state activity, but the role of organized crime groups is fascinating in this. We've known for years about Russian speaking cybercrime groups and how they have made lots of money from cybercrime, ransomware being the cash cow at the moment, which seems like the perfect business model, where you lock someone's computer and you demand a ransom to be paid in cryptocurrency. And we're talking about a multi-million-dollar business here. But at the point of invasion, we wondered, well, okay, so we know that these organized crime groups are operating in Russia, and they have affiliates in other countries, of course. But what does this mean? Now their state has gone to war. We did actually see an announcement from one ransomware group, which said that it was going to use its resources now to respond to, quote, Western warmongering and American threats. So we saw one group declare its loyalty. Interestingly, a Ukrainian researcher then got access to all of the chats, because he knew about how to access some of their data, and he leaked a lot of their chats from years gone by. So there was almost an internal conflict there, where that by declaring allegiance to the Russian state, this international organized crime group actually was put on the back foot. So we're still trying to work that out. There was an incident last week where a ransomware group launched an attack on Costa Rica, and the Costa Rica government has declared a state of national emergency because they don't have access to key systems. So that's something to monitor. What will happen with organized crime groups from now on? And obviously there's the risk of unintended consequences. We all know about the NotPetya attacks from years ago. And when an attack is launched, it can sometimes spread across supply chains and impact people who were not originally targeted. Hacktivism, I touched upon that earlier as well. There's a risk of that as well when that takes place. Sanctions. So if I move on to sanctions, we're still working out how the sanctions on Russia will bite. There's clearly the short-term impact, but there's medium and long-term assessments to make. One way to respond to sanctions is through cyber operations. So that's something I think we really should monitor about. How Russia will respond to sanctions may very well be through launching cyber attacks on the Western financial sector, etc. This penultimate bullet, I think, is really important. I've talked a lot about attacks, operations, and things like that. The key to this is security. You don't fight cyber attacks with cyber attacks. You've just got to bolster your defenses. And I think we've really got to think about that as the mentality to approach this. And my final point on this slide is, much less military language is needed. We have to dampen that down. I just think it's quite unhelpful. What I've tried to sort of describe here as well is I do think a lot of these cyber incidents are below the threshold of war. We've seen them. They just keep ticking along. They're psychological operations. There isn't suddenly a huge uptick at a point of invasion. These are just things that impact our daily lives, the daily lives of citizens of the whole of society, not just military personnel. So I'm going to finish by taking this a little bit wider and just a bit of research that we've done at RUSI on what we think it takes to be a leading cyber nation. I talked about the importance of cybersecurity, of having the structures and capabilities in place. And here's some of the work we've done where we think this is what's required. So you need to have strategy in place, a national cyber strategy in place, and you need to have a comprehensive set of policies, the legal frameworks in place. So, I mean, that's very important. In terms of cyber defense, you need to understand the threat. You need to have good threat intelligence companies for both government intelligence, but also the private sector, good incident response. I talked a lot about the whole of society part in that. This isn't the sole preserve of government to deal with these problems. I've talked earlier about some of the incidents. It was private sector companies that have reported on these incidents. You need to have good law enforcement as well. And then cyber resilience, the third bullet, how you respond to incidents is really important. You need to risk manage your critical national infrastructure well. You need to understand your supply chains, which is pretty much a near impossible task. And the fourth bullet is an interesting one about having a strong technology sector, having the skills in place, good research within academia and the private sector, and a lot of the mechanisms to create a strong cyber ecosystem. The fifth, which I said I think it does play a role, but it's a small role, is having those offensive cyber capabilities in place. But importantly, you need to use them within the right frameworks, have a doctrine, have good legal and ethical checks and balances. And then the final one, to close my talk, and I think this is one of the reasons why I'm very pleased to be here today, is to have good international partnerships and alliances. You can't deal with this cyber problem alone. You need to work with other countries, with like-minded countries, with countries that you don't necessarily agree with on lots of issues about how we secure networks or how we use the internet. But this is a really important part of that. So thank you very much for listening. I hope I've taken you through a journey and ended on the kind of wider strategic points. Thank you.
So I'd like to share what's happening in Ukraine and from a Japanese perspective. And I also would like to talk a little bit about impacts on Japan after the aggressions broke out. And also I'd like to follow up now what James talked about international collaborations, focusing on Japan-UK collaboration in the future. So what we had expected to happen before February 24th. So I think that the major expectations are twofold. So one is massive disruptive cyber attacks on critical infrastructure, especially communications lines, just like what we happened to see in 2014, the Crimea annexation. Something like disruptions to military operations and also cause a panic among Ukrainians, but also to take down communication services so that the Russians can launch a massive disinformation campaigns. And the second one is domino effects by cyber attacks against Ukraine or partnering countries to Ukraine. So because we didn't know if Russia would invade into Ukraine before February 24, but what we already knew about is that if it happens, then surely the West will impose the sanctions, and then Russia would launch wiper malware or computer virus cyber attacks on partnering countries like the United States or other European countries, or they can also launch ransomware attacks to disrupt business operations or government operations. Because that's what we already have seen over the last decade or so. So what we have seen after February 24, so according to Israeli cybersecurity company Checkpoint, the cyber attacks for the first 1 month after the aggressions increased a little bit, but not much as many as we had expected. So cyber attacks on Ukraine increased by 17%, but this is not as much as we had expected. So we wonder why. So as James already eloquently explained, there are possible reasons why we hadn't seen many disruptive cyber attacks against Ukraine and also their friendly countries. So one is Russia's choice. Maybe Russia had totally underestimated the fight back from Ukrainian. So they saw like, okay, maybe we should refrain from launching disruptive cyber attacks so that we can still use their critical infrastructure services, including communication lines after the occupation. Or maybe Russia saw that, okay, we don't actually have to launch disruptive cyber attacks because now we can use bombing or missiles to destroy Ukrainians' critical infrastructure facilities. So we actually do not need to hide to launch covert cyber operations. And also, then we should also note that the Ukrainian has made a massive effort after the 2014, and also the Russian cyber attacks on Ukrainian power grid in December 2015 and also 2016, because the Ukrainians, the government and industry started to build up their cyber defenses on their own, but also with the partnership with NATO countries, including the United States. And even before these aggressions happened on February 24, the United States and also the United Kingdom sent teams to Ukraine, Kyiv, to find out if there are any hidden computer virus already implanted in Ukrainian critical infrastructure. And surely enough, the US team actually found a hidden computer virus in the Ukrainian railway system. And thousands and thousands of Ukrainian citizens had to flee from their own country after February 24. And can you imagine that if they had lost their access to their national railway system after February 24, then the catastrophe would be the greater than we had seen already. And the NATO has been also supporting the Ukrainian cyber defenses. They already renewed cybersecurity cooperations to share cybersecurity intelligence, and also they invited Ukrainians to join the NATO Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence based in Tallinn, Estonia. So, but also there's something we had not expected to happen after February 24. So we certainly hadn't expected to see how these many various non-state actors are taking sides and launching cyber attacks on Ukraine, Belarus, and other countries. So we have already seen international hacker group called Anonymous, cyber partisan from Belarus. And also, as James explained, we've already seen that Ukrainian IT army is launching cyber attacks on Russian websites and also launching the information campaigns. And the Conti ransomware group from Russia and a pro-Kremlin hacker group called QNet are also launching ransomware attacks or cybercrime activities. But this is also worrisome. Why? Because this could lead to escalations in cyberspace, or worse, spill over to other domains. Because these hacker groups can include anybody, maybe cyber criminals or maybe intelligence agency people. You never know, and you cannot do background checks. And then they do not have accountability or state control. So maybe they have a good will. They mean to be good on the Ukrainians or Russians, but this can be have the negative consequences on different countries. And actually, we have already seen one incident. So a maintainer of popular open source software, which is being used by everybody in the world, decided to release codes to wipe data from Russians and Belarus computers. But can he actually justify what he had did? And after he released such codes, and he had a massive criticism from all over the world. And we have seen some cyber attacks in a disruptive nature, but mostly cyber espionage. So according to Microsoft that was released recently, 40% of cyber attacks from Russia are so far disruptive, but other 60% are cyber espionage. So, and of course, these cyber attacks can be from Russia, but also from Belarus or also from China. So for example, cyber attacks are launched using the keywords Ukrainian refugees to lure the people to click attachments or links. And then a phishing email campaign was released against European government officials who are helping Ukrainian refugees. But this is, of course, not for to help the Ukrainians. This is to probably to find out what European countries are doing to support the Ukrainian government and also the refugees. And also we have seen more scam emails for fake fundraisings to make money out of this tragedy. And even though that we haven't seen a massive disruptive nature of cyber attacks from Russia on the countries who are imposing sanctions on Russia, but President Joe Biden and also US governments have repeatedly warned that they started to see evolving intelligence that suggests that Russia is probing the critical infrastructure that are opposing to what Russians are doing against Ukraine. And this is not only from the United States that has already raised the concerns. So GCHQ Director Sir Jeremy Fleming also raised his concerns that Russia's cyber actors are looking for targets in the countries that oppose their Russian actions. So we should stay alerted and keep watching out for possible cyber attacks from Russia or the countries or cyber criminals that are on the Russian side. But we also have to keep in mind that the Ukrainians, even though they are doing excellent jobs in terms of cyber defenses, but they also have disadvantages during the wartime, which we do not see in peacetime. So for example, if we see any cyber attacks that have negative impacts on your systems or critical infrastructure, sometimes you have to send people or transport new systems or devices to that facility. But this wouldn't be necessarily the case because some areas are already occupied by the Russians, and you cannot secure the safety of the engineers or those devices. And you also have to be mindful about enormous stress level because, so for example, communication service companies still have some engineers in war fighting areas in Ukraine, including Mariupol. But these engineers are under the enormous stress and also fears. So this can also impact the human errors, and also these human errors can lead to vulnerable cybersecurity. And Russians already learned that disinformation campaigns are not as effective as they had expected. So that is why that the Russian forces actually use their armed forces to embed into internet service companies in Kherson in the end of April, and they actually rerouted Ukrainian internet services through Russia so that they can deny Ukrainian people's access to accurate information. So these three factors are something that we would never see during the peacetime. And what we have seen the new challenges after the aggressions to Ukraine in Japan. So we started to see more cyber attacks in Japan over the last 3 months or so, but we still do not know if these increase in cyber attacks are all about Russian aggressions to Ukraine. So we still have to see, because most of the cyber attacks that Japan has seen over the last 3 months emoted computer virus attacks, but we also started to see more ransomware attacks. But we do not know if these are for the retaliation from Russia on Japan's the economic sanctions. And because the year of 2021-22 is a very important and also busy year for Japanese national and economic security. So surely the aggressions of Russian forces to Ukraine has had some impacts on new national security strategies to be updated by the end of this year. So reportedly, this new national security strategy would have some sections on hybrid warfare, because we see in hybrid warfare during this war in Ukraine. And Nihon Keizai Shimbun, economic newspaper, also reported that the Japanese government is actually planning to launch a hybrid warfare center, but this hasn't been validated from the Japanese government yet. And Defense Minister Kishi recently visited Washington, D.C. to meet Defense Secretary Austin, but he also notably reportedly visited the US Cyber Command to discuss hybrid warfare. This is actually the first visit by a Japanese defense minister in history. So it sounds like that Japanese government and also ministers are more keen to explore the hybrid warfare and also cyber defenses in collaboration with allies and partnering countries. And Defense White Paper 2022, it's still in draft, but they will also include sections about Russian invasions. And currently, the draft would say that these similar events should never occur in the Indo-Pacific region. And we started to see that Japan and the United Kingdom started and have been deepening our cyber defense collaborations over the last several years. So, for example, NATO CCDCOE in Estonia, Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence in Estonia, conducts annual cyber exercise since 2010. And this year, Japan teamed up with the United Kingdom, MOD, and British Armed Forces to compete against other 31 countries. And actually, to my surprise, not only Estonia, Japan, the United States, or United Kingdom, but also Ukraine sent teams in collaboration with Estonia to compete against and also to learn from the best practices from the 33 countries. So this is really commendable, that how much Ukrainians are determined to learn from each other and also to share what they are learning from this ongoing war. And as I said, and Japan and the United Kingdom have been deepening our security partnerships in the multi-layer levels, including cybersecurity. So given that Japan has been more interested in and also keen to explore not only cyber defenses, but also hybrid warfare, given that that's what's happening in Ukraine. So maybe we should try between Japan and the United Kingdom on the joint exercises on hybrid warfare, not just about cyber domain. And because cybersecurity touches upon many areas, not only national security, but also laws and technologies and energies and businesses. So we need to bring in experts from many areas, not only from technologies. So I am so grateful that the Daiwa Foundations has brought in so many diversified areas of people, and then I really appreciate that you are interested in Japan-UK collaborations and also cybersecurity, because every one of you is counted on cybersecurity, because cyber attacks are borderless, and if you are not interested in cybersecurity, so who would be caring as an internet or IT users to defend from day-to-day cyber attacks on the personal level, organizational level, but also national and international levels. And thank you so much. And I really look forward to hearing your questions.